Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I was at an event recently with Ferial Haffajee, and Ferial Haffajee was talking about a new book, and she was saying one of the problems about debate and discussion in South Africa is that it's fact-free. We often are circulating ideas, appealing to evidence, and the evidence is often made up. We were working. I remember there was a big march around anti-corruption in South Africa, and the figure that was being constantly invoked was that 700 billion rand had been lost to corruption. And when Africa Check looked at the number, it was a complete thumbsuck. Actually, we don't know how much money was lost to corruption. It's almost certainly not nearly as much as 700 billion. What the real number is, we don't know. So I think Ferial has a point there. The work that I do, though, in relationship to that, is that we do facts, but we do the boring facts. So we study stuff which in South Africa generally has not been looked at before. And we study it not because we are all especially boring, although perhaps we are, but because the sense is that it's in the boring facts that's where the real drama is. And it's the fact that activists like yourselves and scholars and others tend to shy away from the boring stuff that allows a whole lot of things to happen in and around the boring stuff, which is detrimental to our democracy and detrimental to our developmental programs. So what I want to do, if you'll forgive me, I want to bore you. I want to spend a bit of time together boring you, talking about stuff which you perhaps have thought about before, but perhaps have not thought about before. And what I'm hoping I'll be able to convince you of is that actually paying attention to the stuff is probably what you should be doing if you want to be engaged activists in the struggle for economic justice in South Africa and democratization in South Africa. So that's really where I want to go in this lecture. So I think the place to start is at a very high level to give you a sense of public sector reform in South Africa going from the 1990s. And I think that I want to make a theoretical point to start off with. A very basic theoretical point, one that is so obvious that it barely needs to be made, and yet, surprisingly, it's a point which perhaps theoretically we understand, and yet we very seldom use it practically. And I want to suggest that this very simple theoretical nuance has great political value. So the point I want to make is that when we talk about the state, we cannot think about the state as a homogeneous entity with its own will. Frequently in conversation or in political conversation, we say, well, the state acted in such and such a way, or the interests of the state are. I think that sort of language is meaningless. I think it's completely meaningless. I don't think the state is homogeneous. I don't think the state has interests of its own, and I don't think that the state acts in pursuance of a particular agenda. Rather, when we think about the state, we have to recognize the state historically, and especially we have to think about the state institutionally. So let's think about the South African state. Let's take the end of the apartheid period, if we want to get a sense, which is where I think is a very good place to start. I'll throw the question to you. When we talk about the apartheid state, there's been an extraordinary scholarship, especially from the 1970s, a kind of radical scholarship associated with political economy, which has given us a certain conception of the state. If we use the language of Mamdani, for example, bifurcated, or the language of Walpe, articulation of modes of production, different kinds of administrations and regimes operating in urban and rural areas, indirect rule through chiefly structures operating in rural areas, but also directly through native affairs departments, and in urban areas a different set of structures. And this is Mamdani's point about essentially why apartheid is not exceptional in relationship to the history of colonialism, but is fundamentally is an archetype of a colonial state. The problem with that kind of those sorts of conceptions as well is that I think that they're too generic. If you think about the apartheid state, we have to think about it institutionally. And this is where things start to get boring. Think about it from the point of view of the Constitution. We've got 3 tiers of government, a national, provincial, and local government level. Each of those tiers of government have their own departments and agencies. National departments and agencies, provincial departments and agencies, and then there are 283 municipalities, each one of them with their own departments and agencies. When we think about the state as a complex, therefore, just at the level of departments, we are literally dealing with hundreds and hundreds of separate organizations. But the idea that they somehow all work on the basis of a common hymn sheet, that they all somehow pursue a common agenda, well, this is the fantasy of every of cabinet, if you like. If only this could be the case. If only you could pass a law or develop a policy and somehow throw it into the system of government, if only government somehow worked in such a coordinated and homogeneous manner. The truth of the matter, it doesn't work anything like that. That these organizations have their own histories and they have their own logics. And I think when we're thinking politically, we have to think, therefore, not of the state as a whole, but one has to think around entry points in terms of the different organizations that compose the state. So what I want to talk a little bit about is a little bit of a history of public service reform, of the attempts to re-engineer the state, the apartheid state, and then think potentially around entry points about how we might engage the state. So the story I want to tell you, I think, is a strange story. It's a story with some very, very strange developments. Ones which you probably may or may not be aware of. One of the stories is a story of the African National Congress's own conception of the state and the initiatives which it pursues in order to transform the state. The other is a story of public management, which has an autonomous story and has its genealogy, its conceptual and political genealogy sits very, very at a very strange angle in relationship to the policies which the ANC is developing. And I want to talk about how these two streams, an ANC's conception of the state, which I'll argue is a Leninist conception of the state, and I'll talk about it, with a tradition in public management which comes out of Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s and becomes very, very influential in public service reform in the 1990s. And what I want to argue is that these two traditions come together, a kind of a Leninist conception of the state, comes together with a public management tradition, and it produces a configuration of organizations which are in a very, very peculiar way. And I think it gives to the current situation we can begin to understand it in terms of the confluence of these two forces. So let's start with the first, an ANC tradition. An ANC tradition. Now we know, and we can argue this. I know it's very popular at the moment to call into question fundamentally the radical credentials of the African National Congress and its policies, in the sense that somehow 1994 was a nothing really, that there was no real transition. There's a fundamental continuity between the colonial period and the post-colonial period in South Africa. Well, if one looks at the level of public service reform, that story doesn't really make sense. The ANC goes very, very far in reorganizing the state along what it regards as on the basis of a radical agenda. So let's try and paint some of the picture here. So what is peculiar, if you look at the sort of history of the notion of public service, especially which becomes popular from the 1960s, is this notion of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy really is underpinned by the idea of an administration which is politically neutral, which somehow merely pursues and implements the policies of the government of the day. Now, this is the question of Lenin, which Lenin poses in 1917 in Russia, just after the revolution and before the Bolshevik coup d'état. And his argument is this: is it possible to use the czarist administration to pursue the communist agenda, to achieve radical transformation? And you all know this, I'm pretty sure, much better than I do. There's that famous pamphlet from 1917, State and Revolution, and Lenin's argument is absolutely not. Absolutely not. You cannot use an administration of the czarist regime to pursue the policies of a revolutionary government. And his argument, therefore, is that the administration has to be fundamentally smashed and rebuilt anew. And in what way must it be rebuilt? The argument is that it must be turned in its genes. Don't forget, all states are fundamentally class states. They are all dictatorships. So a proletarian dictatorship is not some kind of perversion. All states are inherently dictatorships. They all serve particular class interests. And the idea is to undo or to change the direction of the state away from serving the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie in the favor of serving the working class in the case of the Soviet. In the case of the Soviet Revolution, and his means are to massively politicize the administration. What does that really mean? Is to bring the cadres, to bring the administrators, the officials of the public service, of the Soviet public service, directly under the command of the political party. So there's a huge move in the Soviet Union after the revolution to politicize the administration. Politicize not by accident. It's a deliberate attempt to establish political control, the control of the Communist Party over the administration. We can talk about China, whether China is doing something very similar. The 90% of public servants in China today are members of the Communist Party. So one might be able to argue that China is pursuing something, is also working on a kind of on a Leninist model of the public service. Although I would want to nuance that in all sorts of directions. What is interesting about the African National Congress, and you see it right through its policy documents in the 1990s, the ANC comes out of that tradition. We know this well. We know its relationship with the Communist Party. We know the importance of the Road to South African Freedom, the 1962 Communist Party document, which becomes the basis of ANC's policy of national democratic revolution in 1969. Am I talking to a history which you're familiar with? It's this idea that apartheid is not simply a system of racial domination, but apartheid is fundamentally a system of racial domination which is premised on capitalist industrialization. And that therefore what we have in the South African case, which is the policy of the ANC and the Communist Party, is that you have a marriage of race domination with capitalist exploitation. And therefore the anti-apartheid struggle is in its nature also an anti-capitalist struggle. And it's on that basis that you have the historic alliance between the African National Congress as a nationalist organization with the Communist Party, and then in the 1960s with SACTU, South African Congress of Trade Unions, and then of course in the 1980s with COSATU. And there's this fundamental understanding that blacks and workers have common interests against apartheid, because apartheid is fundamentally a system of racial domination and capitalist exploitation. So it's that nexus that informs the alliance. Just as a parenthesis, this is really the difference between the African National Congress's tradition and what is becoming increasingly influential both in academic and political circles is a black consciousness. Black consciousness, and Steve Biko and Fanon, they de-emphasize the link between race domination and capitalism. So if you look at the work for Steve Biko, for example, he makes it quite clear. Yes, capitalism important, but the real issue is white racism. And what the Congress tradition is saying is that you have to understand racism, white racism, in the relationship to capitalist exploitation. So what is important is that the ANC is coming through that tradition, its alliance with the Communist Party. We can argue till we go blue in the face about whether the ANC is a socialist organization. It's not important for my purposes here. What is important is that alliance produces within the ANC a strong sense of the state as inherently partisan, that the state is never neutral. The administration is never neutral and can never be neutral. That the purpose, therefore, is to politicize the state, but politicize it in the right way. So the apartheid state was heavily politicized on the argument, but it was politicized in a way that it served the interests of a white minority and capitalist interests. The purpose, therefore, of radical transformation at the level of the state is not simply to get rid of white administrators and replace them with black administrators, but it's to fundamentally change the very genes of how the state works. Move it away from serving white and capitalist interests in the favor of working in the service of the black majority. And if you look at the policy documents of the ANC, there's tremendous battle that emerges between 1969 and 1985 about whether the ANC primarily serves the interests of Africans in particular or the working class. And if you look at the 1969 documents after Morogoro, it's unambiguous that the African National Congress works in the interest of blacks in general, but the working class in particular. And by 1985, you have this very strange formulation that the African National Congress works in the interest of blacks in general and Africans in particular. It's a real discursive and political shift which is happening in the ANC. It's never resolved, and I think it explodes during the period of Thabo Mbeki, and I think we live in that space. Nonetheless, after 1994, what you start seeing on the African National Congress, and they're driving it through, is this idea of public service reform, which is not about building a neutral bureaucracy. It's not about building a neutral administration, but it's about building an administration which is also subject to the political commands of the ANC. Now, how do we know this is happening? Yes, there are a whole lot of documents which are said. We can see it in a whole range of very specific reforms which take place. And it gives to South Africa, the South African public service, a peculiarity which really is, by international standards today, quite unusual. So what is the first thing? I don't know whether we can, if I can give a lecture which is also kind of dialogical, if I can ask you questions. So one of the peculiarities of public service reform in South Africa is around recruitment. You see it in the 1994 Public Service Act. Who gets to recruit public servants in South Africa, and how are they recruited? Now let me give you an idea of how it happens in what, we like to think of ourselves as a developmental state. So how does recruitment happen in China? Remember what I said, 90% of public servants are party officials. Other developmental states, developed Malaysia, South Korea, and most of Western Europe, which are not developmental states necessarily, Britain, France, Germany, Britain and France especially France after Napoleon, after the Napoleonic reforms, Britain after the Trevelyan reforms of the 1870s, Germany after the 1870s as well. What is the peculiarity around how they recruit? What they don't do is they don't recruit via political mechanisms. So most recruitment, and this is China as well, so even though most public servants are officials are members of the party, recruitment nonetheless goes through a process which is quite separate for the party. There's a universal entrance exam, so all people wanting to be public servants have to apply and then write an entrance exam. Often the standards of that entrance exam are very hard. It's very difficult. In France, for example, to get into the public service, you have to write an exam which will allow you entry into what's called the École Nationale d'Administration, which is the National School of Administration. Probably one of the most difficult exams, certainly in France, maybe in the world. So to become if you're a public servant in France, it is the most highest status role because you are regarded as part of the absolute intellectual and political elite of France. It's the same with Britain. Britain historically, members of the public service, especially after the 1870s, were all graduates of Oxford or Cambridge. After 1968, after the 68 revolt, that gets widened, so they're graduates of what are known as the red brick universities, London University, for example. They're all elite graduates. In South Korea, public servants are all, the highest levels are all, almost without any exception, they are graduates of Seoul University. So there's a sense of public servants entry into the public servants is of great prestige because you are drawing from your absolute elite, absolute intellectual elite, and the way into the public service is through a universal entrance exam. For those of you that worry that this might be a colonial instrument, the origins of this particular device, the universal entrance exam, is actually Chinese. It's Confucian. So there's an extraordinary history of public service reform in Germany of, I can bore you, Jesuit priests in Germany translating Confucian texts in the late 19th century and applying Confucian principles to the reorganization of the German state after unification. And what do? It's this idea, which is a Chinese Confucian principles of a universal entrance exam into the public service. Now the entrance exam does a couple of things which are important. One, it selects people on the basis of merit, so you attract highly skilled, good, highly qualified people. But it does something else which is really important. It creates objective measures into the public service. And what it does is it creates a barrier to selection of people on the basis of personalistic networks. So for example, in 1870, in the Trevelyan reforms of Britain, what those exams do is that they break the ability of the aristocracy to appoint its own family members into the public service. It breaks those kinds of personalistic networks by creating a principle of merit. It's the same thing with China. You might have to be a member of the party, but you nonetheless have to demonstrate some autonomy. There's an autonomous process of being selected. Okay, so how do we do it in South Africa? Incredibly, we don't go for that route. We don't go for this route. We go for a route which is, I think, is a Leninist route. We go for a route of appointment via the party, or rather, because it's not there in the constitution, we go for a route which is highly, highly politicized. So we have an unusual configuration in the South African situation which arises, you see it in the Public Service Act, and then you see in the various amendments to the Public Service Act in 1997 and then again in 2007. It's the same principle. Appointments to the public service are the responsibility of what's called the executive authority. Now, the executive authority is defined in law as the minister at national level and as an MEC at provincial level. Premiers are also, in later amendments, given certain roles with regard to heads of departments. So what you have is political control over appointments. The National Development Plan talks about it starts off with the Presidential Review Commission in 1997, which talks about this conflict emerging between the political and administrative interface, and we can talk about that for a moment. What it refers to is the tension that emerges between senior bureaucrats who are responsible for managing their departments, but they have no control over recruitment and firing of staff. It's not their responsibility. So they must design a process of implementation, but they can't appoint the people they need in order to implement. Why? Because it's at the discretion of a minister. Not only is the minister responsible for recruitment, but a minister is responsible, it's an amazing situation, for the description of the job role. So the ministers, it's a political function to describe the job. Now think about this. You are the DG, or you are a head of department. After 1994, and we can talk about it as well, I don't think we've got time, there's a huge move to decentralization, to debureaucratize the South African state. In enormous amounts of responsibilities, both at financial but also at administrative and operational, are moved away from central institutions like the Public Service Commission, for example, or the State Tender Board, I'll come to that in a moment, down to departmental levels. So for the first time, departmental managers are incredibly powerful. Indeed, from 2001, we create something called the Senior Management Service. Is that a name that's familiar to any of you? It's this idea, SMS, it's this idea that the public service must be managed, not by bureaucrats, but by managers. And the managers are given enormous discretion in terms of strategy for their departments, the design of their departments, and finances. The one thing they don't have control over is recruitment. It remains a political function. So, ministers and MECs write the job descriptions, they have that power, and they are responsible for recruitment. And then there's something else which is very strange. The way we actually practically recruit, it's through an interview by a selection panel. So again, no exams, no objective criteria. Instead, public servants are appointed through a selection panel, and it happens through an interview. Highly subjective, highly subjective. Who appoints the selection panel? It's at the discretion of ministers and of politicians. So you have in the design of the public service, at key and fundamental places, the design is meant to maximize political influence and political control over public servants. So you have this very strange situation. Public servants are, by legislation, accountable to the standards of the Public Service Act and to legislation. But at the same time, in practice, they're also accountable to the political party by virtue of the way that they've been appointed. Don't forget, from 1997, the ANC launches its Cadre Deployment project, arguing ostensibly, fundamentally, that the public service is staffed by white Afrikaans males that are hostile to the radical agenda of the ANC, and that it's necessary, therefore, to move them out. There's a document from the 50th Congress of the African National Congress. The final report talks about the public service as a home to a counter-revolutionary network of public servants. There's a need, therefore, to exercise real political control of the public service because there's a serious concern that it is a bulwark of counter-revolution in the post-apartheid period. So what we've done politically in South Africa is to create a structure which allows for high levels of political control over public servants. So that's on the one hand. That's the one story I want to tell you. The second story, and this is not a story of the ANC, although it's implemented by the ANC, and it's a story, if you like, of hegemony. It's a story of the hegemony of ideas. Certain metaphors and certain practices come to the fore in the 1990s, which are incredibly, incredibly influential. 1979, Margaret Thatcher comes to power. She drives a revolution against the welfare state. And associated with that revolution are new ideas about how you organize the state. Basically, the argument is that if you can, you privatize as much as you can. But to the extent that the state has a role, it needs to be fundamentally changed in the way it's organized. And what does the change look like? The change is government should be less bureaucratic. Government should be much more operate like businesses, look like businesses. What do businesses have? They're not bureaucracies. They have managers. They have managerial structures. So what are managers? Why are managers better than bureaucrats? Well, bureaucrats are kind of boring and lack innovation. What do bureaucrats do? Bureaucrats follow rules. And they take orders and they follow orders. They lack innovation. They're not enterprising. Managers, so the theory went, managers are kind of cool. Managers, first of all, they dress better than bureaucrats, but most importantly, they're innovative. They come up with ideas to suit the local context. This is the theory. So if you want to keep a role for the state, the idea was that you reorganize the administration away from the bureaucratic model, hierarchical, based on rules, towards something called managerialism. So Britain introduces the 1980s. It becomes incredibly influential in international organizations. The New Zealand government reforms the welfare state on the basis of the new public management. In Australia as well, it's influential in Clinton's reforms in the US are strongly driven by this move to managerialism. These ideas become hegemonic in certain places. The World Bank is pushing them, the IMF is pushing them. It kind of makes sense that the way you reorganize the state is on the basis of this public management model. You move away from bureaucrats, having bureaucrats rule followers, towards managers. These ideas become unbelievably influential in South Africa in the late 1990s, especially during the Thabo Mbeki administration and under the period of Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, who is the second Minister of Public Service and Administration in Mbeki's cabinet. There's an amazing document which you can all have a look at. She happens to write her master's at the time she's minister. And you can see she regards herself on the left of the ANC. She's on the Politburo of the Communist Party. She knows that the public management ideas originate in Thatcherite Britain, but she's drawing on, and this is interesting, she's drawing on a kind of Labour Party appropriation of the new public management under Tony Blair. So have you ever heard of the third way? What you start seeing in Labour Party circles, in the social democratic circles, is an attempt to appropriate some of these ideas of Thatcherite origin in order to achieve social democratic purposes. And the argument goes something like this. Well, let's not fixate on arguments about whether it should be the state or whether it should be the market that provides a service. Let's rather worry about who is best placed to provide a particular service. Should it be the state in some circumstances, maybe in the market in others? And the move was under Tony Blair, the so-called third way. Let's not have an ideological discussion about public or private ownership with regard to service delivery. Let's just define, and this is the language, the best mechanism to provide services. So this becomes unbelievably influential in South Africa and the ANC in the late 1990s, especially under the Thabo Mbeki administration. What you see in DPSA, Department of Public Service and Administration, in the late 1990s, and especially in 2001 when they launch it, is the massive move to managerialism. The idea that we must, to the extent that we must reorganize departments on this managerial basis. So they create, as I mentioned earlier, the Senior Management Service. It starts in 2001. The idea is to have at maximum 3,000 managers. high levels of financial autonomy and discretion, authority over the day-to-day life of the organizations, designing operational systems, doing strategy. As I said, one big problem is that they couldn't appoint their own staff, but nonetheless, driving through change in the organization. Today, the senior management service is around 10,000 people. From about 1,500 in 2001, it grows very rapidly. By 2005, it's already 7,500 people. All right, so I told two stories. How am I doing for time?
I think, how are people feeling? I think carry on for another, say, 10 to 15.
Okay, so this is where I want to conclude. I want to bring the two stories together now. So you've got on the one story, the one side, efforts to create huge room within the public service for political control, that allowing political masters under the authority ultimately of Luthuli House of the ANC to exercise high levels of discretion and control over who public servants are within the public service. That's on the one hand. At the same time, you've got the great fashionability of this new public management to create this class of senior managers who are given high levels of discretion and autonomy within their departments. I think the ANC goes very far in advancing this model. Why? Because they see the senior management as the place really where they can exercise political control to drive through the reconstruction and development program, all the sort of radical initiatives of the ANC's developmental program. What the whole model presupposed, though, is that the ANC itself could hold it all together. The ANC itself had enough institutional integrity that it could somehow control the whole process itself. And here's where I think things have started to fall apart. The ANC, as we know, especially since the mid-2000s, probably after 2009 especially, has become highly fragmented. There's tremendous contestation within the ANC itself, tremendous contestation. We see that contestation within the ANC playing itself out across various institutions of the state as well. So, the key institutions which have become under tremendous threat were the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks and the police. In 2012, SARS lost its autonomy, and then in December 2015, the National Treasury, the minister was financed, and we know all about that. What I think we're seeing is tremendous contestation within the ANC playing itself out in a whole range of state institutions. What does this mean? I think politically this means that we're at an incredibly important moment. If we believe, as I believe, and if one takes seriously a left-wing agenda, which I do, that the state needs to play a key role, we need to build administrations that can play a developmental or progressive role in their areas. So the question is, how do we achieve this? I think we have to rethink the model and the organization of the state. I think we have to reorganize whether this political model works in the way in which it's worked, whether we do not need to think about creating autonomy for public servants relative to political authority. I think that's something which we definitely need to do in the medium and long term. But in the short term, there is something which we definitely need to do. We need to get over, there's a huge hysteria in the public media and in public discourses, and you might well be having them at your own private dinner tables, about the incompetence and corruption of public servants. It's not true. There are incompetent public servants, there are corrupt public servants, that is absolutely the case, but you must understand that language is highly racialized. It's associated with this idea that a black government comes to power and everything falls apart. There are many very, very talented, very committed public servants trying to do their jobs, but they're doing their jobs in environments which are increasingly politicized, where the political turmoil is so oppressive that it's getting in their way of their ability to do their jobs. So the one is to reduce the political interference in their departments, and the second is to stand by public servants. So this is what I would push for if one was thinking of a political role. It's to stand by public servants with integrity that are trying to do their jobs. There are a couple of public servants currently in the public domain who I think deserve our political support. And we can talk about the story. SARS, the public servants at SARS, Ivan Pillay, Johan van Lochenberg, the whole crowd, it's Andrew Leckay, Adrian Leckay, Pete Richer, Yoliswa Piquet, a whole group of public servants trying to do their job in SARS. Unbelievably successful public servants that have come under the most extraordinary political pressure and have been purged, and now there are now there are criminal charges against them on the basis of complete fabricated rubbish, a so-called rogue unit, which has now been established quite clearly that it was complete, utter nonsense. The same thing is happening in the Hawks. Policemen trying to do their jobs. General Sibiya, for example, who's investigating Gluli, he was suspended and charged. He's won 7 cases in the courts. 7 times he's been vindicated in the courts. In the last High Court judgment, the prosecutor was called before the judge to explain what the heck is this case doing in my court, and the prosecutor had to admit that they were acting under political instruction. General Boyson from the KZN Hawks as well. It's the same story. Remember the Cato Manor hit squad story? Nonsense. Persecuting of public servants. IPID, you might have your own personal feelings about Robert McBride. It's the same process. Rosemary Hunter in the Financial Services Board. These are public servants trying to do their jobs. They come under the most extraordinary political pressure, and some of them, and most of the time, they buckle because they don't have our support. That civil society organizations and activists, their focus is elsewhere. So my appeal to you and to think strategically is to start thinking around civil society organizations to defend and support public servants trying to do their jobs with integrity and with honesty, of which there are many. There are many of them that are buckling, but there is a growing movement of those public servants to stand up. We saw it now at the SABC, of journalists at the SABC beginning to stand up against the extraordinary political interference coming from the high officers in the SABC. I think there's potentially a burgeoning movement of public servants beginning to assert themselves, but I think they definitely need our support. That's where I want to end. Thank you.